Hi guys, welcome to this tutorial. I'm looking today at the Power and Conflict poetry. This is the 2020 question. So the named poem was Remains, and the question was around people who've been affected by conflict. So I've chosen, in my response today, I'm going to look at exposure, and I'm going to think about the ways in which soldiers have been affected, and I'm thinking about war. So obviously in this exam you would have your remains in front of you, and you'd have to think of your second poem and try and as best you can remember a few quotes. So what I tried to do, just to give myself a bit more challenge, was to do this question without either of the poems in front of me. This can be a good way to do a bit of revision, just push yourself that bit more, don't have a poem in front of you, just see what you can remember. So what I've done here is I've tried to do, quite a short response. It's just 2 sides long, but it would be, this would be a top grade response, and I'll talk you through the reasons why. So I always start a comparative essay with a both, a kind of a both and a whilst structure. So I always find a point of commonality within my poems, and then I look at what is the kind of difference between them, and that's how I just do always my openings to these kinds of questions. So that doesn't matter if you're looking for a grade 5, a grade 7, a grade 9, the same approach for all of them. So you can see I've started with both Remains and Exposure, focus on soldiers who've been heavily affected by the bloody, devastating and traumatic effects of war. I've mentioned this a number of times, but what I always try to do is start with sort of a thesis statement that includes a list of 3, basically 3 evaluative words that sort of sum up something that they've got in common. So that's what I've done here. My thesis is that they've both been heavily affected by the impact of war. Then my points of difference that I'm sort of setting up is that whilst Remains focuses on the PTSD experienced by a soldier who has returned to civilian life, Exposure explores the ongoing present trauma experienced by World War I soldiers. So I just get in my kind of sort of subject, how are they different, what's the focus a bit different for these poems. Okay, then I'm going to go straight into, and I would do this approach in the exam. I'd start with the poem I had in front of me, just because you've got access to the quotes there, you'd have to think off the top of your head what things are. So in Remains, Armitage uses a colloquial graphic tone to describe the soldier's vivid recollection of the image of agony. The dysphomistic tosses his guts back into his body, demonstrates a brutal disregard for the looter's life. He's treated with no dignity, and his body is simply disposed of like trash. Clearly this vivid memory is troubling to the narrator, whose refrain, possibly, speaks of his troubled conscience and recurring doubts about the justification in shooting this man. Okay, so as I say, this would be a top grade, this would be a grade 9. Some of you might be looking at some of the vocab I've used here and be not sure what it is. Colloquial, I hope you know, it just means sort of chatty and conversational. And then I also talk about it being graphic. So this is just a degree of my own evaluation. In my take on this is that it's very, the imagery there is really in your face, and so anytime I'm using words like graphic and vivid, I'm being evaluative. So I go on to talk about the dysphomistic. A dysphomism, you may have heard of euphemisms. A euphemism is a nice way of putting something. A dysphomism is the other way. You find like a worse way to put something. So in terms of death, people often are euphemistic. They say passed away, or passed in there, they're eternally resting rather than died. Dysphomism is like finding a worse way to say this. So tosses his guts back into his body is really quite, as I've evaluated here, brutal. So lots of evaluative language here, and so again I'm focusing on the vivid memory. And then we've got plenty of things in here, the refrain, that's a structural device at the end of the poem. Okay, so I wanted to, there's different approaches for these kinds of questions. I could have just carried on with Remains and talked about everything I wanted to talk about on that, and then moved on to Exposure, or you can sort of zigzag. For the purpose of this essay, just because I wanted to keep it short, I'm doing a zigzag approach. So this sense of doubt and repeated questioning of actions can also be seen in Exposure through Owen's refrain, so another technique. What are we doing here? Here, Owen focuses on the wider purposes of war, demonstrating the ways in which this soldier no longer feels conviction about his reason for fighting and dying for a country that seems unable to provide its soldiers with shelter, warmth or dry clothes. In both poems, these individual soldiers have been dramatically affected by their traumatic experiences, leaving them to question their entire purpose. So hopefully you can see how I've made sure I've got some comparison in here. I've focused on writer's purpose, and I've got another technique in. I've looked at refrains in both of the poems actually and how they're being used. And I've got that nice link to the question, so it's the idea of how are people being affected. Okay, I'm zigzagging back to remains, particularly if you end up, or if you're a student who finds it hard to get a lot written in the time, I would advise this zigzagging approach, because it means you won't run out of time and you will have kind of got coverage of your poems. So I'm going back to remains. In remains, Armitage explores the impact of PTSD on a soldier's state of mind. The alliterative, so I've got a technique here, drink and drugs, remind us of the addictions many soldiers use as coping mechanisms. However, even these substances can't flush out the blood shadow, because the looter is metaphorically dug in in his mind. Hopefully you'll notice I've got lots and lots of embedded quotes. Rather than here's a quote that shows, I just integrate it within my own writing. The soldier's belief that the man is not dead in some distant sun-stunned land shows readers that the traumatic memories and intense guilt are pervasive. Pervasive is a great word. You know, it just pervades, it infiltrates, it goes in, you know, you can't get away from it. They haunt the man, and in an allusion to Hamlet, so an allusion is a reference to another literary text, both his sleep and his dreams are disturbed. Finally, in the allusion to Macbeth, so I've got two different allusions to Shakespeare plays in this poem, the reference to my bloody hands shows that the soldier is plagued by guilt and responsibility. The soldier feels he has blood on his hands and seems unable to move past the terrible event. So again, it's this idea of him being affected. So I'm keeping that focus on the question, you know, how are people affected by the conflict? So I've got a kind of detailed evaluation there. In exposure, the soldier is less affected by the things that have happened. So that's a comparison, a difference. So less affected by the things that have happened. Indeed, he is more impacted by the weather and fear of dying in a hole in the wintry conditions than of bloodshed. So I've got here a detailed comparison. So I'm saying, you know, this soldier is much less impacted by the actual warfare than he is of the terrible sort of weather and conditions. So the immediate reference to the merciless icy winds that knife us and the refrain "but nothing happens" reflect the sustained horror of watching friends die from exposure, whilst the soldiers do nothing but wait to be moved like pawns by those who control their very lives and deaths. So I've got this developed evaluative tone here. I was thinking, as I just read back over it, I could have talked about here about, you know, the immediate personification. I could have zoomed in more here on the sibilance of the merciless iced east winds. If you've had a look at my tutorial on exposure as a poem, you hopefully will have picked up on some of that extra technique. But wait till we move to Thesis. So yeah, so in both poems, it is the sheer helplessness and exposure to trauma that has been devastating to soldiers who are left broken or abandoned by those who should have cared for them. So I've got this evaluative comparison at the end. Now this is very much, you know, I could have gone on and written 4 times the amount I did, but I wanted to show you how, you know, realistically, I think this took me about, I don't know, it was about 20-25 minutes to do this. You've obviously got longer, but you're not an ancient crusty English teacher. But I wanted to show you the quality you can get in a shorter amount of words. So if you do end up, you know, for whatever reason running out of time, or you're just in a like, I'm not going to get stuff done, you can still get up to that top grade, even in, you know, a lot less time. So the takeaways from this are try and get some detailed comparison in there. Try and get as much evaluation as you can, embedded quotes. You do need methods, and you need to be referring to what the poet does. But really, at that top grade, 7 to 9, they want your ideas, your opinion, your evaluation, and your take on the question. Okay, I hope it was useful to see that response, and see you next time.